It was an average morning in the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Pine Ridge, where the sun was shining brightly and the birds were chirping. The residents of this tight-knit community were all used to the routine of quiet streets and familiar faces. One of the homes belonged to Sarah, a young woman who had recently bought a small plot of land and built her dream house. Over time, she had become acquainted with the other neighbors, but there was one woman who always seemed to stand out: Karen, a middle-aged woman with a strong opinion about how things should be run. Karen was one of those people who made sure everyone followed the rules, no matter how small or insignificant they seemed. She was a member of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and took her duties very seriously, often reminding everyone about the rules in the most inconvenient ways possible. One particular rule she loved to enforce was the use of public roads. Sarah's land, which was located on a corner lot, had a path that many residents used as a shortcut, thinking it was a public road. This was something Sarah never minded, as it didn't really affect her day-to-day life. The path was small, winding, and led directly through her property, but there had never been any issue until Karen started raising concerns. It wasn't until Sarah began to notice more and more cars using the path that Karen paid her a visit one afternoon. With her hands on her hips and an expression of disapproval, Karen demanded Sarah open up the land for public use, claiming it was a necessary thoroughfare for the neighborhood. Sarah, politely but firmly, explained that it wasn't a public road and that her land was private. Karen wasn't having any of it. She argued that it had been used as a shortcut for years and that it was important for the community's ease of access. "You can't just close it off now," she insisted. Sarah, feeling a little overwhelmed by Karen's persistent demands, explained once again that it wasn't a public road, and it was her right to decide who had access to it. As Karen left, she gave Sarah a cold, dismissive look, muttering under her breath. But little did Sarah know, this interaction was just the beginning of a series of increasingly dramatic events. Over the following weeks, Sarah received multiple notices from the HOA demanding she open the path for public use. The letters grew more aggressive, claiming that it was in the best interest of the neighborhood. Tension started to rise as Karen began talking to other neighbors, encouraging them to petition Sarah to change her stance. A few of them even came by her house, voicing their displeasure with her decision to keep the path closed. Some neighbors began avoiding her, seeing her as difficult and unreasonable. But for Sarah, it was her land, and she had every right to decide who could use it. The issue escalated when, one afternoon, Karen showed up at Sarah's door, holding a stack of papers. She had a petition with signatures from nearly half of the neighborhood, demanding Sarah allow everyone to use the path. Sarah was taken aback by the sheer audacity of it, but remained calm as she declined once again. That's when Karen snapped. In a fit of frustration, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, claiming that Sarah was illegally blocking a public road. "This is an emergency," Karen insisted, her voice trembling with anger. "I need a police officer here right now to stop this crime." Sarah was stunned by Karen's actions and could hardly believe her ears. As the call continued, Karen began ranting about how Sarah was depriving the entire neighborhood of access, and that it was causing a traffic nightmare. "This is a public safety issue," Karen continued, though there was no traffic in sight and no safety hazard to be found. Sarah's heart raced, and she felt a mix of disbelief and frustration as she realized that Karen was not going to let this go easily. Sarah was still processing the bizarre 911 call when the police arrived a short time later. They parked their squad cars in front of her house, with Karen standing by the road, nervously wringing her hands. The officers, looking slightly confused, approached Sarah and politely asked for her side of the story. Sarah explained the situation calmly, detailing how the path was private property and how Karen was now making a scene by involving the authorities over something that was not an emergency. The officers nodded, but there was a hint of hesitation in their expressions. They weren't sure how to proceed, given that Karen had been so insistent and had involved the HOA. As Sarah spoke, Karen stepped forward and immediately started to interrupt, demanding that the police take action. "This is an urgent matter. I've been telling her for weeks. She's breaking the law," Karen insisted, pointing accusingly at Sarah. One of the officers held up a hand, asking Karen to remain silent while they finished talking to Sarah. They asked if she could show proof of the land being private, which Sarah was more than happy to provide. She pulled out her property deed and showed them the clear boundary lines marking the path as part of her land. The officers took a moment to review the documents, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, this is private property," one officer said firmly. "There's no legal obligation for her to allow public access through here." Karen's face reddened, her frustration growing by the second. "This is ridiculous," she cried out, throwing her hands in the air. "This is a public road. The neighborhood needs it. People rely on it." But the officer wasn't swayed. "It's private property, ma'am," he repeated, his tone more authoritative this time. Karen stood there, seething, as the officers began to walk away. She was fuming but still determined to get her way. Sarah, on the other hand, was feeling a sense of relief, believing that the issue was finally over. She thanked the officers, and they assured her that there was no issue as long as she maintained the boundaries of her property. The officers left without incident, but Karen wasn't ready to give up. She immediately began calling around to other members of the HOA, telling them that the police didn't know what they were talking about and that Sarah was still in violation of community guidelines. She sent angry emails, started petitions, and even showed up at community meetings to continue her crusade against Sarah. It wasn't long before the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the news of Sarah's illegal actions. While some neighbors were sympathetic, others were influenced by Karen's relentless campaign and began to side with her. The HOA board, who had initially been passive, began to back Karen's stance, claiming that Sarah was undermining the spirit of the community. They issued official warnings, urging Sarah to reverse her decision or face potential legal consequences. Sarah started to feel overwhelmed again, but she wasn't about to give in. The situation, however, was starting to take a toll on her. She was constantly receiving letters from the HOA, increasingly accusatory and threatening. Every time she walked outside, she could feel eyes on her, whispers from neighbors who were now viewing her as the bad guy. The peace she had once enjoyed in her quiet home was starting to disappear. Karen, meanwhile, was growing bolder in her actions. She started taking matters into her own hands, showing up at Sarah's door uninvited, demanding that she open the path or face consequences. "You don't want to make an enemy of me, Sarah," Karen would warn her, a sly, unsettling smile creeping across her face. It was becoming clear that Karen was not someone who would back down, no matter what. Things continued to escalate for weeks after the police visit, with Karen becoming more erratic in her attempts to pressure Sarah. Karen organized another neighborhood meeting, but this time she had a new tactic. She invited a local news reporter to cover the ongoing dispute. By now, Karen had painted Sarah as an unreasonable homeowner who was selfishly blocking access to a public pathway, and the media coverage only amplified the drama. The headline in the local paper read, "Local homeowner denies public access, causes traffic chaos in Pine Ridge." The article was filled with quotes from Karen and a few sympathetic neighbors, all painting Sarah in a negative light. Sarah couldn't believe it when she saw the headline. The situation had spiraled out of control, and now her name was being dragged through the mud. Even some of her friends and family started questioning her actions, which made her feel even more isolated. But instead of backing down, Sarah decided to stand her ground. She reached out to a local attorney for legal advice, hoping to find a way to end this once and for all. The lawyer explained that Karen had no legal standing to force Sarah to open her land for public use, especially given that it was clearly marked as private property. The attorney also mentioned that if Karen continued to harass Sarah, she could potentially face legal consequences for trespassing. With this information in hand, Sarah decided to take a more proactive approach. She filed a formal complaint against Karen and the HOA, citing harassment and wrongful accusations. As part of the process, Sarah was able to present her case to a mediator who would help resolve the conflict without going to court. When the meeting finally took place, Sarah was ready. Karen, still holding on to her belief that she was in the right, showed up with a stack of papers to support her claims. The HOA representatives were present as well, continuing to back her up. But Sarah, armed with her legal advice and a calm demeanor, made a powerful case. She explained how the situation had escalated unnecessarily, how she had tried to be reasonable, and how Karen had caused undue stress in her life. She also presented evidence that Karen's actions were causing a division in the community and affecting her well-being. The mediator listened carefully and, after much deliberation, ruled in Sarah's favor. Karen's demands were deemed unreasonable, and the HOA was ordered to cease its harassment. Sarah was awarded a formal apology from the HOA, along with a small compensation for the emotional distress the situation had caused her. As part of the resolution, Karen was also issued a warning regarding her behavior, and she was instructed to stop involving the police unless it was a legitimate emergency. The tension in the neighborhood slowly began to fade. While some neighbors still sided with Karen, most were relieved that the conflict had come to an end. Sarah, feeling a sense of vindication, was finally able to return to her life with peace of mind. She closed off the path once again, but this time, there were no more complaints. As for Karen, she didn't take the loss well. For a while, she avoided Sarah, but Sarah could still hear her muttering about the unfairness of it all. Over time, Karen's influence began to wane, and the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Sarah learned a valuable lesson in standing up for herself, and though the ordeal had been exhausting, she felt empowered by the outcome. The community, though shaken, began to realize that sometimes standing up for what's right could bring about unexpected results, and that not everything is as simple as it first appears.